Welcome to Lost Kingdoms, a game that I hold an enormous amount of nostalgia for, as it was one of those games that the entirety of my old friend group in middle school played. A pretty standard thing, really. We all had a few games we loved to play that barely anyone else had heard of. This happens to be one of mine. Interestingly, this game is made by From Software. Yes, that From Software, the creator of the Souls franchise. Despite people making it seem like they had never made a game before Dark Souls 1, they have quite an extensive history. It dates all the way back to 1994, where they released Kingsfield for PlayStation 1, which was the first RPG to be released on the system. It doesn't look great. I'd argue not even for a PS1 title, but the thing I love with pre-Souls titles is that they are endearing. You can tell a lot of passion was put into these games, even if they are far from being perfect. I mean, just look at the back of the box of Kingsfield. Either they couldn't at the time, which I doubt, or they didn't know how to make images transparent, as at the time I assume they didn't have any dedicated artists. It's pretty funny to look at. Anyhow, as you can see, they made a lot of games, but never broke through into the mainstream until Dark Souls came out. I'll come back to this point later, but they have a lot of potential in their old library. They got some horror games with Echo Knight and Kuon, a few different RPGs they could probably reuse to great effect like Shadow Tower and Eternal Ring. Not to be confused with Elden Ring. Recently they released a new Armored Core, and while it wasn't a smashing hit like Elden Ring, it is, from all accounts I've heard, a great game. Clearly the devs are a lot more skilled than they used to be. Back to Lost Kingdoms. Normally I would start by talking about the development cycle of the game, but I can't find any information regarding it. I've tried some typical googling, going to some forums, I even tried searching for developer interviews in Japanese but came up with nothing. As a last resort, I asked ChatGPT, but he also didn't know anything. All I can confirm is that the game didn't have a director, so I'd assume the major decisions went to the game's producer, Atsushi Taniguchi. He worked at From Software for quite a while. He was a producer for the game's sequel, Kuon, the Kingsfield PSP ports, was a 3D model for Armored Core, and was a producer for FromSoft's most hardcore title, The Adventures of Cookie and Cream. I own this game as a joke. Sadly, the PAL version has the original title. Oh well, it's still kinda funny. So really, all that we really know about the game is that it's a From Software game from 2002. For Lost Kingdoms, the gist of the story is that a dark fog is taking over the land. Thankfully, they have never used a similar trope in their games, and it has now approached the gates of the castle that the main character, Princess Katia, is in. Her father set out to stop the fog, but ordered her to take the runestone within the castle and flee if the fog came to her. The world consists of 5 kingdoms, each having their own runestone. If one wields a runestone, it allows them to use cards that have monsters sealed inside of them. With this power at hand, she sets out to find her father and potentially stop the fog. To do this, she needs to collect the other runestones from the 4 remaining kingdoms. Most stages don't bring much to the table, but in Castle Grail, she's confronted by a mystery woman who is also out to collect the runestones. They fight, and Katia comes out on top. The mystery woman awkwardly informs us that her name is Helena after being beaten in a fight. Katia takes the castle's runestone with her. It'll take a while before we meet our antagonist again. In the meantime, Katia finds another runestone deep in a set of mines guarded by a puppet master. From the mines she enters Burden Field, where a large-scale battle took place long ago. This is where she meets her father, who unfortunately is dealt a mortal blow by one of the monsters there. After burying her father, Katia knows that she has to push on to stop the fog. Going past the field, she reaches Castle Wit, where a guard informs her that the runestone is kept in the nearby church. Seeking out the church, she finds the runestone, but Helena returns. She does a typical move from the 2000s, where she doesn't fight us but sends a strong monster our way in the hopes that it'll do the job. Spoilers, it doesn't. Immediately following this, Katia receives information that Helena went to the Colosseum, where the two have their final battle for the last runestone. It turns out that Helena is from another continent and is a princess, just like Katia. But on her continent, a man known as the Enchanter has taken all of the runestones and is now ruling with an iron fist. Knowing it's the only way to stop this madness, Katia makes her way to the Enchanter's stronghold. To do this, she's advised to go to the Ru'arok temple, where it is said that an ancient being resides. These stories are true. Deep within the temple awaits a god of creation. She tells us that her brother, the god of destruction, is the one behind the fog, but the god of creation refuses to interfere as it's now the humans' world and therefore their problem. Sounds really unfair to me when they're up against a god, but okay, whatever. She at least helps a little by teleporting Katia to the Enchanter's stronghold. Making her way to the Enchanter's throne room, they duel. As Katya defeats the enchanter, it's revealed that he was used as a vessel for the god of destruction, and to stop the fog she has to defeat him.
Or do you? Son.
And that's that. The day is saved. As I said, it's not the most interesting story, it's mostly there to give you an excuse to go to different areas. I naturally glossed over parts, but they don't bring any more depth to the actual story. For example, I mentioned the places that Katya is able to know where to go at times, that she's, quote, given information, end quote, and this information is given to her by Gerd, who runs the card shop in the game. That's it. Gerd seems to know all this, as it's hinted that one of the gods took the shape of a mortal, and I'd assume that'd be her. This is typical for any FromSoft action game. Kingsfield has a relatively bare-bones story, so does Eternal Ring if memory serves, and all the Souls games aren't exactly dialogue-heavy games either. But they also circumvent this by adding lore to item descriptions, which was a unique twist on things. Really, it's no surprise that this game would follow the same fate. Alright, with that done, let's talk about the real meat and potatoes of the game, the gameplay. As you have noticed from the footage in the background, it is a real-time card battler. You have 3 different types of cards: independent cards that roam the battlefield on their own, summon cards that are essentially just a strong attack or effect in the form of a card, and weapon cards that work similarly to summon cards that are monster attacks for you, but they're usually weaker and don't get a fancy cutscene. Going into detail of each card type, the independent cards are generally monsters on the field that try to attack enemies, but there are some independent cards that work differently. For example, the card Stonehead flies into the air upon being summoned and functions like a trap. When something walks under it, it squashes them for a lot of damage. The Stone Golem forces enemies to focus it while it runs around. It can't attack, but the distraction is useful. The Carbuncle spins around the summoner, dealing a small amount of damage if it hits anything. It's like a small reflective barrier, I guess. For the summon cards, they don't all attack. Some cards, such as the Fairy, heal you a percentage of your HP, and some cards are essential to have stability in your deck, such as the Mind Flayer that restores used and inactive cards. More on what that actually means a bit later. We also have more defensive type cards, such as the Fire Golem that gives you a fire shield for a short time that hurts anything you come into contact with. The attack cards are the most straightforward ones. They all do, in fact, attack. The difference mainly lies between their attack values, and some have the potential of inflicting status effects such as slow or petrification. There are some subcategories of cards I didn't mention, but the point of the matter is that there's a high variety of cards in terms of mechanics, and you're able to build your deck around what you enjoy using. So those are the different types of cards in the game. How do you actually use a card? It's quite simple. Every card has a magic stone cost that's displayed on the card, and that's used every time you use the card. You get magic stones by hitting or killing enemies. You can store different amounts of magic stones depending on how many rune stones you have, but 30 is the maximum once you have all of them. You can still use cards if you run out of magic stones, but you take 10 damage for every missing magic stone. So if you use a card that costs 10 magic stones but you only have 5 on you at the moment, Katya will take 50 damage. A simple but effective system for not properly managing your resources. One technique you can use while throwing independent monsters is to keep holding down the button of the card you just threw. By doing this, you can control where the card lands, but it also gives Katya iframes until the card lands. You can avoid all attacks by doing this. It is an intended mechanic, as the game teaches you this as well. After you use a card, it is now exhausted for the rest of the stage. As I mentioned earlier, cards also have another state called inactive, and they're put into this state when you discard cards from your hand during battle. Once the battle is over, the inactive cards are put back into the deck and can be used during the next fight. That's why card restoration monsters are important. You want enough of them so you can restore your deck if needed. If you don't have cards, you're doomed to lose, as Katya herself isn't able to attack. Now that we know how to use cards, how do you get them to begin with? There's a few different ways. The most straightforward ways is to find them in chests in the various stages, and you get a few cards every time you clear a stage. The amount of cards you get depends on how well you clear the stage. Some other ways to get cards come from the card shop. You can either buy cards with gold, which I'm pretty sure you only get by selling cards in the first place, transforming cards, which you can do after the card has earned enough experience, which it gets by being used or when it lands the final blow on an enemy. And lastly, in the shop you can copy a card if it has enough experience, which, well, is pretty self-explanatory. You can also gain cards by giving red fairies that you find in stages to Alexander. He naturally has some unique cards like the doppelganger if you found every red fairy in the game. One final way to obtain cards is to perform a card throw. By holding L and throwing a card at an enemy, they will take a tiny bit of damage. But if it kills the monster, you capture them by turning them into a card. It's a nice idea. Like a monster you see in the stage? Just get it low and chuck a card at it to add it to your collection. All this leads nicely into deck building, which is pretty straightforward. You're limited to 30 cards per deck, but there's no restriction on how many of a single monster you can have in the deck. If you have 30 copies of a card, you can build an entire deck out of that. To actually use a card, you need to be in a stage, and the stages themselves are pretty simple. You might have some small puzzle here and there, but generally you just need to walk through to the end to continue onto another stage. There's no monsters in the overworld, and as the stages are typically empty, this gives an eerie, isolated vibe. As there are no monsters in the overworld, all fights, except for bosses, are spawned through random encounters. The stages are assigned chunks, and when you get an encounter in that part of the stage, it is turned into a battlefield by cutting it off into an arena. You're not forced to fight, but if you run from the battle, it exhausts a random card from your deck. So before running, you should weigh your options if you're going to spend more cards fighting than running, or if there's one card you don't want to take the chance of losing. In an attempt to enhance combat, all cards have a unique type ranging from Earth, Water, Fire, and Neutral. Typings are either strong or weak against each other except for Neutral, as it's, well, neutral. If you've ever played Pokemon, it has a similar logic to that. Water beats Fire and Fire beats Wood. And naturally that means Wood is less effective at dealing damage to Fire, and Fire is less effective at dealing damage to Water, etc. It's not essential to know this to beat the game, but it adds a little bit more depth to the combat system. The game is on the easier side. I went with an attack and summon focus deck for most of the game, only throwing in a few independent cards when they were completely busted like the Steel Skeleton. I ignored most of the independent cards as the AI can be a bit, Yikes. I never had an issue of clearing a stage until the final one, but that one's also ridiculously hard. Going through the stage up until the battle against Enchanter, you have 5 required battles, all of which are old bosses by the way. And once you defeat the Enchanter, you're immediately forced to fight the God of Destruction, who has an attack that brings you down to 1 HP if you can't dodge it. He also starves you for magic stones and has a ton of health. And worst of all, if you die at any point, you have to do the entire stage all over again. You also can't replay previous stages until you beat the game, so you can't grind for some new cards and try again. You might be able to keep the XP from killing the enemies here, and that way you can get new cards through copying or transforming, but I'm not sure if that works. But that's it for the single player experience. There's a few post-game stages after that, but the gameplay loop is the same. The game does have a versus mode, and if you look at the effects of certain cards, it will mention that those cards cannot be used if the versus mode's fair play rules are enabled. They clearly put some thought into balancing the game, which is nice, but outside of the versus mode there's no incentive to interact with other players, which is a bit weird for this type of game. I get the feeling they wanted more player interaction, as in the versus mode you can bet cards, but what's even the point when you can get every single card in your own game? Not only that, you can copy your cards if you have enough experience. It takes time, yes, but you can theoretically get 30 copies of every single card in the game this way. I appreciate its inclusion, but at the same time it doesn't feel like a very thought out system. Other than that, I don't have too much to add. I like the overall aesthetics of the game. They are, for lack of better words, very FromSofty. The monster models just look like something that would fit into many of their other games. While the character designs are unique but still have that FromSoft flair to them. I find it interesting that they decided to go with a female protagonist. Playing as a female character was a novel concept back in 2002, and the only other examples I can think of that had any sort of major success was Tomb Raider, Siberia, and Metroid. Granted, with Metroid you didn't really know that you were playing as a woman until the very end of the game. Lost Kingdoms also came out before Beyond Good and Evil, which is another highly praised game with a female lead. Looking at Katya's design, it's not overly flashy or, as they typically were at the time, over-sexualized. Yeah, she shows a bit of skin, but with what some other games did at the time, this is nothing. I do have an issue that her design doesn't really show off the fact that she's royalty. She has some flashy jewels and ornaments here and there, but nothing in her design exactly screams out, "Brave Princess." She looks more like an adventure type character that has no royal connection, but overall I like her design. Aside from those hideous boots. What the hell were they thinking? My favorite aspect of her design is her cape. In-game they sort of resemble wings, which makes her look somewhat like an angel figure. Fitting as she saves the world. I also like the flare that cards burn to display how much usage they have left. It just looks cool. A somewhat typical 2000s thing is that the loading screen is interactable. You can move the loading text around with the analog stick. Something else I find rather amusing is that they didn't translate the, albeit short, voice lines that characters have during cutscenes. When I played this as a child, I thought it was a cool made-up language. The music is, passable? It has a certain charm to it for sure, but it's nothing I listen to with any sort of regularity. In case you were curious, this is also the game where my outro music comes from. I mean, the guy shares my name and everything, it felt like a good fit. Before wrapping this up, I want to shortly gloss over the second game. For the most part, it is much the same and, to me, feels more like an expansion rather than a full-blown new game. The story is much shorter than the first game, so I won't even mention it, but it did make some interesting changes from the first game. The most obvious change is that there's no longer any random battles. All monsters are now active at all times in the stage. This helps make the world feel more alive, although that might be at a detriment if you like the eerie feel of the first game. As random battles are no longer a thing, they've changed the discard system. Now when cards are discarded, they are put at the bottom of the deck rather than being inactive until the next fight comes up. They also added a new card type, transformation cards. With these cards you transform into a monster unable to control an attack with it. They also added a new typing known as mech, which, boringly enough, functions the same way as neutral. However, now when you use cards of a certain type you will gain affinity with that typing, but less with its opposite type. This means if you use a lot of water cards, your water affinity will increase while earth will decrease. What they've done is to expand the amount of stars that the cards have, and if your affinity level is less than that of the card's rank, the card's magic stone cost will be doubled. Summons have been changed to have 2 different attacks that you can choose between rather than just one, effectively doubling the amount of summon cards. One last thing that comes to mind is that you can do combination attacks. By holding down Z, you can power up cards in exchange for doubling their cost, but if you power up certain combinations of cards, they will do a unique attack that uses up all those cards. And that's Lost Kingdoms. It's a series that will always be special to me regardless of its flaws, and that I come back to every now and then. Like with all other early FromSoft games, it's a passion project that misses the mark a lot of the time, but it's endearing. You just get a feel that they truly wanted to make something special out of it. This is why I wish FromSoft would try their hand again at some of their older titles, as they are now more experienced than ever. There's so much potential for this game in particular, as this type of card battle is hard to come by. They would just need to reevaluate its systems a bit and give it a proper modern polish. For example, they could reimagine the attack cards that they aren't only monsters. Maybe doing something akin to Phantom Dust, where your cards are attacks that the character themselves perform. Or maybe you could use several cards in a specific sequence to form a combo or something along those lines. Either way, it'd be nice to see a modern take on the game. But unfortunately, I wouldn't get my hopes up for this game or any other old From Software game to see the light of day ever again. Yes, recently we got a new Armored Core game, but I imagine that's mostly due to Miyazaki liking the franchise rather than trying to revive older franchises. When he joined From Software, his first task was to work on Armored Core: Last Raven as a planner in 2004, and later on he directed Armored Core 4 and its sequel, Armored Core 4 Answer. He's worked on Armored Core a lot, so I'm not surprised that he wanted to make a new one. I understand why they haven't touched their old flagship title like Kingsfield or something with a similar gameplay loop like Shadow Tower or Eternal Ring, as that's essentially what the Souls series turned into. Hell, Demon Souls is meant to be a spiritual successor to Kingsfield. But it's sad to see that we might never get anything similar to Lost Kingdoms, Echo Knight or Kuon ever again, which are games that all play vastly differently from that of the Souls series. I would love for From Software to give their past more attention. Those games deserve it. Thank you so much for watching all the way through. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you haven't already. My name's Alexander, and I'll see you next time.